Today we're going to be talking about starting new armies in Warhammer 40k, whether that's a brand new army for you or you're new to the game. And if there's one thing every army needs, it's an opponent, which is why I'm happy to announce that this video is being sponsored by Vox Link, a new social media app for gamers to find games in your local area. It's currently on Kickstarter, and we'll talk more about it later in the video. What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and if there's one thing I know, it's that Warhammer 40k has a lot of armies in it. So if you're jumping into a new one, the decision of which can be daunting and very important. Warhammer armies take a lot of time and money, so making the correct decision of which one you're gonna pick up is certainly worth the time to consider. So I'm gonna be going over some criteria and questions that you should ask yourself when you're looking to start a Warhammer 40k army. These are gonna be broken down roughly in order of importance, but that's always down to personal preference. So you may weigh different criteria or considerations more or less than I do. This is mostly just going to be my opinion on things. As I go through each of these criteria, I'm going to be giving some examples for each and armies that may correspond to them and different categories within. And I also have a bunch of other videos that can potentially help you out in conjunction with this one. I have one talking about all of the different armies in Warhammer 40k, a little bit of background and flavor for them, as well as the core mechanics and playstyle of each of those factions. And on top of that, I have a video talking about representative lists for every single faction in the game as well. As always, if you enjoy my Warhammer 40k content, go ahead and hit like, subscribe to the video. All the YouTube stuff, I'm sure you've heard it at least once in a different video today. And just whatever they said there, to do the same here. And let's talk for a moment about Vox Link. If you're watching this video right now, you and I probably have something very important in common. We both spend way too much time on YouTube. We both like playing miniatures games. But there's one special secret ingredient that miniatures games need to be absolutely great: an opponent. But those can be hard to come by if you're playing in a new location, new to the community, or maybe just moved to a new area, which is why I'm happy to talk to you about Vox Link. Vox Link is a new community building app designed by tabletop gamers for tabletop gamers. This new app is live on Kickstarter as we speak and will allow you to post up that you're looking for a game and the type of game that you're looking to play, and allow others to find and message you based on proximity. You'll also be able to use it to find new play groups, register for organized play events, communicate with local players, and even get notified about new content from your favorite content creators. Really, it's a wholesale social media app designed explicitly for tabletop gamers of all varieties, including those playing miniature games like Warhammer 40k. At launch, the Vox Link app is going to be free, but you can join as a premium member. And if you jump on the Kickstarter today, you can get enormous discounts on your premium membership. Premium membership is going to unlock some special abilities like event publishing and bracketing, 5% off purchases with brands such as Magnet Baron, Baron of Dice, and Dicehead Games, exclusive content on the app, and a verified badge, as well as exclusive beta access to the app and all of its features. Getting established in any new community is always hard, and especially so for the tabletop gaming community, which is why we need a tool like Vox Link to link players together.
I see what you did there.
So diving into the criteria that you should be considering when picking up a new 40k army, the first one I have is playstyle. Now, what does playstyle mean? It's a little bit of a nebulous concept. Essentially, you want to pick an army that operates on the tabletop in a way that you find fun and interesting. If you enjoy moving fast units, attacking people in melee, shooting people to death, or absorbing damage, those are each good examples of a separate playstyle. And every faction in 40k has a very distinct playstyle. This is especially true if playing and enjoying the gameplay of Warhammer 40,000 is a primary motivator for you, since picking an army whose playstyle you jive with makes you much more excited to get out and get that army on the table. One thing that you'll find is that a lot of the different components of the hobby, both those off the table like the lore and aesthetic of an army, and those on the table like playstyle or army list building, have a very synergistic effect, where if you enjoy one facet of them, it's going to enhance your enjoyment of all the other ones. That's why Warhammer 40k is a hobby game. The meshing of the hobby and the gameplay is pretty integral to the experience, and that's why it's also a bit of a lifestyle game, because you'll often find that these different components introduce you to brand new hobbies you didn't even know you liked. That's a long-winded way of saying that if you enjoy playing your army on the tabletop, that's going to motivate you to A, get more games in so you can continue to relive that experience, but also then paint your army so you have a painted army to play on the tabletop and dive into the other aspects of the hobby. I also find that planning, optimizing, and thinking about an army that I'm interested in the interactions of and operating on the table makes me much more excited to spend a ton of time and energy on it. So ultimately, ask yourself the question, what do you want your army to do? And what kind of units do you like? Do you like big tanks or smaller, faster units? And this is much easier if you've played any other miniature games or similar strategy games where you know what your ideal playstyle looks like. And here are some examples for different army playstyles. If you like elite, heroic armies, where each of your models is basically a character in and of themselves, try Adeptus Custodes. Alternatively, if you like fast hit-and-run armies that play a very guerrilla-style warfare, try one of the Eldari factions, either Eldari proper, Harlequins, or Drukhari. For aggressive horde-style gameplay, try Genestealer Cult. They tend to be a little bit trixier, or Orcs, who are very aggressive and relatively straightforward. And for more complex psychic phase combinations, try something like Thousand Sons or Tyranids, who play a much more convoluted combo-oriented style. Or if you just want to play a slow, tanky army that can absorb a ton of damage, try something like Death Guard, or some forms of Space Marines like Salamanders or Dark Angels. And that moves us on to the second criteria, that being the aesthetics of the army. And this is another core component of the hobby of the game. At its heart, Warhammer 40k is a miniature game, which means that the miniatures that you use to play the game are not just your game pieces, they're also a personalized representation of your investment in the experience. The miniatures are super important, and you're most likely going to spend a ton of time assembling and painting them. And let me tell you from personal experience, that's much more fun when you actually like how they look. At the very least, even if you're not putting a ton of time and effort into the assembly or painting of your models, and even if you're getting them commission painted or getting them secondhand, anytime you're playing them on the table, you're going to be looking at those models, and enjoying that visual experience is going to enhance the other facets, especially gameplay. Now, Warhammer 40k has a very unique aesthetic, and so you'll find that not only do factions not really tend to fit into a specific aesthetic category, but they also aren't exactly what they appear from the get-go or the marketing. I think Space Marines are a very good example. On the outset, they look kind of generic. They're a power-armored sci-fi soldier that we see in a dozen other franchises like Halo or StarCraft, but they tend to toe the line between that high-tech sci-fi look and a more Baroque Gothic look that is kind of bespoke to Warhammer 40,000. This means if you look at a Space Marine, a poster that's an intercessor shooting his bolt gun, for example, not all of the Space Marines that you'll be playing on the tabletop are going to look exactly like that guy. If you want that high-tech military sci-fi look, you can find it in Space Marines, but it tends to get splashed in with the other varieties. But you can also try checking out Tau Empire, which are extremely high-tech and have a lot of that semi-realistic near-future sci-fi going on, or Leagues of Votann, which has a little bit of an astropunk sort of vibe. They look very much like moon base explorers or something like that. For a more historical or diesel punk look, you can try Astra Militarum, who take a lot of cues from historical modeling, and especially World War I or World War II modeling, or Orcs, which have that real rivet punk style, being kind of the less professional end of the spectrum and having most of their equipment just haphazardly bashed together. A lot of 40k is also very heavily fantasy inspired, so you can find a lot of fantasy style factions in things like Chaos Space Marines, Chaos Demons, Drukhari, and Adeptus Custodes. A lot of these looks are ripped directly out of the pages of World of Warcraft. Before you hit me up in the comments, I do know that Warhammer's been around for longer. Please don't at me. But I'm just trying to make a point that they look very similar to a lot of fantasy franchises. Aesthetics is totally up to personal opinion, so really the best advice I can give you is to take a long, hard look at any prospective fractions that you're going to be picking up and pick out any centerpiece models or units that you really like the look of, and that can kind of inform your aesthetic preferences when it comes to comparing factions to one another. Now, the next section here is basically the same vein as aesthetics, and I think when it comes to hobbying gameplay, the third pillar of that triumvirate is the lore of the game. If delving deeply into the lore of 40k is your thing, which I know it is for a lot of people just diving into the game who get hooked on the lore to begin with and don't even know anything about the tabletop game before they jump in, playing an army that you enjoy in the background of the game helps you construct a narrative around your army and get excited about recreating that narrative on the tabletop. I've always found that the disposition of an army in the lore helps me connect to it, less so the specifics of its lore, but I tend to, for example, like human armies that are more competent and professional, or non-humans that are kind of totally alien to what a normal person would be able to comprehend. That's why I tend to gravitate to factions like Tau or like Tyrannid, who exemplify those traits. 40k has a lot of different themes like these. If you like esoteric cults obsessed with knowledge, you have things like the Thousand Suns. If you want a more multifaceted, loose warband style, the Chaos Space Marines are there for you. We have the passionate uprising of the Gene Stealer cults that creates kind of this camaraderie, or the extreme religious fervor of Imperial factions like the Adeptus Sororitas. A lot of times you'll find that this kind of disposition in the lore informs a lot of the aesthetic and even gameplay of an army, and so picking that feel that you enjoy is going to help you a lot when it comes to picking your favorite faction. Now, moving on to a couple other points to consider, especially if you are a new player to the game. The first one is going to be model count. Now, I think it should be obvious at this point in the video that there is a lot of time investment into painting, modeling, and learning the rules for a new Warhammer 40k army, and that makes the model count of that army a very important consideration. An army that consists of 100 infantry models is going to take a lot longer to put together and paint up, especially since infantry tend to be very heavily detailed than an army that consists of several vehicles or walkers. Obviously, if you're okay with playing with larger armies, this is less of a consideration. If you really enjoy that factory style painting and putting together huge units of guys, be my guest. But if you're looking for a less intensive entry to the game, you can try checking out factions like Knights, either Chaos or Imperial. These are vehicle-only factions that tend to only be composed of maybe a half dozen to a dozen models. These are composed either of huge Titanic Knights that are enormous models, but if you don't want to spend too much time painting them, you don't have to. However, they have a broad canvas to work on if you enjoy getting into the nitty-gritty of the hobby experience. And they have a lot of smaller walkers like Armigers that kind of function as enormous infantry for the faction. Adeptus Custodes is another one that plays normal infantry and bikers, although theirs tend to be a little bit bigger than normal. However, they don't play many of them. It's probably the most elite army in the game, with each model costing 2 or 3 times as many points as models from other factions. This tends to mean that Custodes play with a handful of models, maybe 10 to 12 infantry, depending on the build, a couple of bikers, and a couple of vehicles, making the barrier to entry extremely low. Leagues of Votann is another one that tends to focus almost exclusively on vehicles and bikers. This is kind of a happy medium between something like Custodes and something like Knights, where you are going to be playing a few large, heavy vehicles like Hecates and Land Fortresses, but you're going to sprinkle in a couple infantry and more elite units, like Einhir Hearthguard or Hernkin Pioneer Bikers. These are examples of entire factions that tend to play pretty low model count focused, but many armies also have vehicle or monster focused subfactions or builds that you can work towards building this way as well. Well, now the barrier to entry for these armies tends to be relatively low. They also tend to be a little bit more forgiving on cost, so if the cost of entry is important to you, then playing a lower model count army like one of these certainly helps. But the downside to consider is that they also tend to be relatively unforgiving when you're playing, since making the wrong moves with a unit during a game is much harder to recover from if you have significantly less units than your opponent does. Now, segueing right off of that point is going to be our next criteria here, the ease of play. This is mostly going to be a consideration for newer players or people who are just jumping into the hobby without much established knowledge, or just for people who want to dive into armies that aren't too confusing to prepare for the tabletop or understand when you're playing them. The easiest to play armies in 40k are relatively resilient, well-rounded armies that rely on good fundamentals and less on gimmicky, faction-specific mechanics and niche interactions, or rely too heavily on a single phase of the game, whether that be shooting, melee, or psychic. Armies that are pigeonholed into a single phase can be tough to learn, and especially if you're a new player, they give you an incomplete picture of playing the game. You may get very good at the shooting phase, playing a gunline-only army, but as soon as your opponent catches you in the fight phase, your knowledge starts to evaporate very quickly, and if you ever move off of that faction or change your build, can be kind of difficult to compensate. This is why Space Marines, Necrons, and Death Guard have all been starter set factions for the last couple of editions. They're relatively tanky depending on their build. They rely on good core mechanics and have a mix of shooting and melee styles with a little sprinkling of more esoteric powers and psychers mixed in. This makes these three factions also good starting points for a new player, and from an aesthetic standpoint, all three of them are easy and super fun to paint. On this topic, I'd also propose Grey Knights for this reason. While they do rely extremely heavily on the psychic phase and some gimmicky teleporting mechanics, for the most part, their units are all just solid all-rounders that operate in every phase. All of their units are psychers, so you'll know the psychic phase like the back of your hand. They also have pretty strong shooting and very good melee on top of that, and can also be relatively fast. This gives you an incredibly good holistic view of the game, since you'll be able to experience every facet of it, and as an army to prepare for the tabletop, they're one of the easiest, since most of their units are actually just built out of the Strike Marine kit, and they're probably the easiest faction in the entire game to paint to the studio scheme. It's just silver. You just paint them silver and then you're done, which, you know, that's pretty good. I certainly recommend getting creative with your paint scheme, but if you want to save some time, Grey Knights, it's a good way to go. And with that, that is all of my tips for choosing a new army in Warhammer 40k. Let me know down in the comments section if you feel that I missed any particular criteria, if you have any factions that you think are appropriate for new players, and the reasons why. And big thanks to everyone who supports the channel, either over on Patreon at patreon.com/TacticalTortoise, YouTube channel members, and Twitch subscribers. All you people are great, and I love you very much. Remember to keep it classy, folks. Have happy wargaming, and I'll see you on the battlefield.